Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Aaron Roberts. I'm the founder and CEO of Perspective Intelligence, a United Kingdom-based cyber intelligence consultancy. We specialize in open source intelligence and help individuals and organizations understand their risks from cybercrime. I'm delighted to be joined here today by Peter Tyson, the manager from the Open Source Intelligence Group within the New Zealand Police Force. This talk is going to be a really fascinating insight into how, as OSINT practitioners and as teams, we can work to effectively develop coping mechanisms and understand how and why we might be exposed to trauma and how we can deal with it, and make sure that we're not leaving ourselves open to things like post-traumatic stress. Peter, thank you so much for joining us today. It's going to be a really fascinating talk, and I can't wait to just get right in. So over to you.
Cool. Hi, Aaron. Yeah, thanks very much for the intro. I'm going to correct you ever so slightly on behalf of my New Zealand police brethren. They will remind me that they are a police service and not a police force, and they will do so at length if I make that mistake myself. Yes, they're here to serve, not to force, which I quite like that, to be honest. But yeah, thank you for the introduction. Yes, I set up and run the Open Source Intelligence Group in the National Intelligence Centre in New Zealand Police. We're a team of open source professionals. That is the sole focus of our job, which leads us to do some really interesting work. And what I want to talk to you today about is how you as individuals, but also as teams and as organizations, can better manage your exposure to and the impact of graphic material. I think it's a really underworked area, and I'm hoping that these ideas and strategies are something that you can take away and deploy yourself. First of all, I will note that I will be sharing some stories of people's experiences of trauma. These may bring back your own memories of dealing with some of this material. There won't be anything in the slide deck that is traumatic in and of itself. There's no visual or text content that is horrible. Just want to note that. And I have put a few little pictures of my puppy, which featured in the thumbnail for the video throughout the slide deck. So hopefully that'll also keep you cheerful. He may make an appearance if he causes trouble.
I'm counting on it.
So, what's that? Sorry?
I'm counting on it.
You're counting on it. He is extremely adorable. I'll give him that. He gets away with a lot. So goals of my talk really are to help you think a little bit differently about graphic material, take you beyond just some of the mental health strategies you may have heard, to give you some practical tips and ideas for better handling graphic material in your workplace. So these are ways, both technical and organizational, to deal with graphic material better. To better arm you for conversations with peers and seniors. I'm very lucky to work in an organization which does care about and take seriously the impact of graphic material and trauma that people experienced at work, but some of you may not be. And so hopefully some of these ideas will give you a few levers to apply to your own organization's management. And to also help organizations approach the challenge in a more integrated way. That is the challenge of supporting staff and ensuring their welfare and wellness. It's really important for a range of reasons. So the first thing is sort of definitionally, what are we talking about here? There are a lot of ways that this topic is discussed. There are a number of the phrases and terms you'll see on the screen there. User-generated content I find often in the journalism space, but also you'll see these days people talk about moral injury, and that's where dealing with this kind of material can be confronting to your personal wellness and your personal ethical and moral foundations, I guess, and the impact that dealing with graphic material over time has on your own sort of wellness and the destabilizing effect of seeing horrible stuff in the world, basically. So we're going to put all of those together in a big bucket I'm going to call graphic material. One of the things I like to remind people of is that it can be quite surprising. Like people can be surprised by the fact they have to deal with this. So it's on us as experts to remind people of the impact of work. Before dealing with graphic material, there was 37% of journalists didn't think they would see any, and 46% were not prepared for seeing it. 56% didn't think it would have an impact. Now, this study's from about 10 years ago. I'd like to think that the journalism space has got a lot better at it. I would say it has. But back then, people getting into dealing with user-generated content just hadn't even considered the impact it could have, which, is interesting. And another study I found showed that for the Boston Marathon bombing, it was kind of a focus study on the impact of this on people in Boston. And what they found was that people who watched a lot of content about it, because obviously it featured back to back on the news, reported a lot of stress exposure from the exposure than those who only dealt with it a little bit. And what was also really interesting was that unlike direct exposure to a collective trauma, the repeated media exposure seems to have contributed to the development of trauma-related disorders by prolonging or exacerbating acute trauma-related symptoms. So let me unpack that a little bit for you. What they're kind of saying is that someone who was actually at the bombing or nearby had less trauma than those who were watching it for hours a day, watching the chase hours a day on the news. I find that fascinating, and it kind of lines up with some of the personal experiences I've seen amongst staff that I've worked with, where those who are first responders, they have a job to do, or those who are witnesses have something going on. They're running away, or they're dealing with a massive adrenaline spike after they've had a car accident or what have you. And their memories of the situation can be pretty gray, blurred out, and soft focus, you could say. Or if they were first responders, they were doing something important to help people. But if you're sitting in an office, coolly, calmly watching difficult material day in, day out, you don't have some of the protections there from your brain going into overdrive mode. Your brain is animated, but not to the same degree. And so I think the impact of the material can be much greater at times. This can be a surprise to people when you talk to them about this and you explain the science that has been done here. It can be quite illuminating to people who might otherwise be skeptical of the impact of graphic material. And I like to think of graphic material as something like radiation. You can deal with a little bit over a long period of time and come out relatively fine. You can deal with a lot over a very short period of time and never touch it again, and you'll probably be okay. But dealing with a lot over a long period of time can be really, really debilitating and have real significant impact. And I think what we see is the brain and the body become animated, heightened sensitivity to adrenaline. They get into a state, much like you see perhaps with people who've been in conflict zones. Just the body is hyped and amped and prepared for action at all times. And that can lead to kind of a stress responses in the body as it deals with the impact of this day in, day out. So my advice is, consider this as a great metaphor. Don't be dosing yourself up. Don't let people dose you up with vast amounts of trauma for long periods of time. And sort of what we see in terms of the impact of trauma, there are a range of symptoms and signs that are listed here. I think we can all be familiar with them just casually. We understand that you can deal with depression, increased sleep anxiety, or increased difficulty sleeping, anxiety. People can abuse substances. People can be angry, get cynical, all of those sorts of things. Those are all fairly normal experiences, and hopefully nothing more than the mild ones are those that you've experienced. And I'm sorry if you've had to deal with a lot more than that. Here's a puppy to help cheer you up, maybe. But working with objectionable material can also lead to some quite subtle stresses. And I think this is where you're dealing with material that isn't kind of obviously difficult or graphic. When we think of graphic material, it's really common to cast our minds back to, for those of us of a certain generation, either Al-Qaeda or ISIS and the terrible things that they got up to, and the footage we had to deal with, or the videos we dealt with, or the stories we dealt with from those times. But I find staff even dealing with the regular day-to-day work in my space, with crime, with stories of youth doing bad things and then having to read into their personal histories. It can be really stressful and upsetting. And I like to think that this subtle stress is sometimes easy to miss, especially if you come from that really graphic video or personal experience. Understanding that there are still a lot of stresses and stuff that isn't obviously distressing is important, really important to think about. And I also want to raise one of the challenges you deal with is that if you're dealing with a really difficult task, it spins up like this. I'm sure we've all had this experience. For a period of time, the intensity is really high, and then afterwards it dies away. And a question for Aaron is, where do you think you feel the impact of that work? Is it at the start of it, in the middle, towards the end, or well after the event?
I think it's always going to be well after the event. So if it's not D, it's going to be E or F, which we can't see on the graph.
Yeah, way off. Yeah,
but,
yeah. And I think we all have stories. Those of us who have dealt with graphic material, we all have stories of sometime after the work, when everything calms down, that's when the impact happens, right? That's when we notice. For me, it was a bus ride home one day where I realized that, I've been looking at all these terrible videos for weeks at a time, and I got really upset about it. I got really emotional on the bus, of all places. Uh, and again, a similar thing was in a movie. I was watching the last of the Hunger Games films, and all the kids get bombed at the end of the film. And that was way too close to stuff I'd been looking at work. And I had sort of heart racing, breathing thing was going, and I had to sort of talk myself down, using the cognitive behavior techniques, talking to myself, noticing, yes, you're having a reaction. Yes, I can notice that. And I was lucky that work had given me some of that coursework. But what I think that the point of this is to remind you that you're often not the person who's necessarily going to be the person at point A, point B, or point C who's deploying the strategies to look after yourself, which is what a lot of the rest of this talk is about, how as teams and organizations, we can ensure that at points A, B, and C, staff are well supported and integrated with the care that they can have available to them, and processes and systems that will support them, because they'll be too busy. They'll be too in the moment, too excited, charging into their work, and getting very passionate about it. And just as a little side note, I don't know if anyone else has noticed this, but in my organization, I think the OSINT experts, about 30% of them are neurodivergent in some way. I think we all just love diving deep into problems, hyper focusing on them for a while, and then pulling out and moving on to the next one. And I think that's also can lead to us not paying attention to our own wellness, right?
That's a really good point. And
So yeah, it
also,
really is.
like
We did a big count.
what you just said as well around not always being the person. It's like thinking you see the trauma, you see it getting exposed, and not understanding how to cope with that until after the fact, when somebody turns around and goes, "Oh, that was bad. We should probably figure something out."
Have a chat about it.
Yeah, it's it's can be very difficult, especially with some of those more traumatic things, and not, and then it gets in some organizations not necessarily being able to go home and just like vent about it in a way that you could do with your colleagues, but I guess in some cases you're just going to be talking to the people who are already traumatized themselves as well, so it's understanding that and bringing it all sort of in a more thought out way, and having those mechanisms in place before you can necessarily be deeply affected.
Yeah, and I've got some strategies for that. Those are really, really important points. I'm probably going to come back to every single one of them, so I won't reply in depth, but yeah, it's really important. And I generally find, like with a lot of injuries, a harm from dealing with graphic material can often recover, or you can recover from that just with a bit of self-care, a bit of time, and you will come out the other end with some war stories that you can terrify your friends and neighbors with, potentially. But you will, generally come through this okay. And for those more difficult experiences, many organizations offer psychologist support. But it often feels to me that that is not a panacea to all issues, right? The choice is not wait for the mental breakdown, go see the psych. We should be building support all the way through our work-life experience. I'm lucky to work in an organization which does that, but I know many don't. And you do occasionally hear stories where the wellness support at the front line is harden up, and if you have a breakdown, then go see the psych. That's not really enough in this modern age.
I know
And
within the private sector, it can be a case of they bring you in as an OSINT analyst as a contractor, so they don't necessarily have to worry about having like their own staff like necessarily exposed to the things. It's like, well, you've already got the experience, and we like your skills, but also if you get like traumatized, it's your problem. Goodbye.
It's a you issue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is one way of dealing with it, and I understand like why you probably want somebody who's already got hopefully those pre-coping mechanisms in place. But
it's a really important point. If you're at home contracting in, then gosh, try and network with other people in a similar position, just to find people to share with. You don't want to be bottling that stuff up. It's difficult. So I think a regular check-in with a psychologist is fantastic if you have that option, but it's not really enough. And that's really where the rest of this talk is going to go. And we're going to talk about how we can put together a range of pieces of a puzzle, really, to produce overall wellness. So all of the other all the strategies I'm going to go through, organizational and individual, help build, I think, a more full wellness system for you. I'm going to break this up into 3 broad sections. So first of all, individuals and teams, peer-to-peer, how they can support each other and themselves. Then we'll look at technical mitigations to dealing with graphic material. And finally, we'll go over some organizational level strategies as well. And I think when you pull them all together, you end up with a organization or team that has a strong wellness culture and impact. So talking first of all, peer-to-peer, like dealing with the old first aid story, the first thing you need to care about is looking after yourself. It's important that you deploy your own strategies to look after yourself before you perhaps try and help other people. Otherwise, you might just end up in a situation where you're traumatizing each other all day long. So what can you do as an individual to protect yourself and make your wellness better? I think first of all is if you're in a team environment or you build a virtual team environment with peers, discuss your experiences with your colleagues. Like we all have stories about things we've dealt with, things we experienced, how we got over it. It's really important you share that and build a culture where that is normalized. I think it's definitely, as team leads, make it a normal thing that you'll talk about the work, that it is difficult or not, and how that is impacting people. You've got to get over any kind of macho culture where you're not going to share this. We're just going to toughen it out. It's not healthy. Talk with your supervisor. Hopefully you have supervisors that are really engaged with you and are having these conversations. But if you're not, maybe be the person who starts that conversation. And you can discuss a bunch of the topics we're going to go over here. Make wellness part of your performance assessment or as a casual coffee catch up. Bring it into the conversation. I like to encourage people to share their rules and limits. It might be that dealing with people is something that you can't handle, or women or children, like that's your limit. And I find obviously people with young families, that is really commonly a limit they don't like dealing with. But you may be okay with harm to animals to a degree. And vice versa. I once talked to an Australian officer who they couldn't stand harm to animals. It was her real red line. She was a real animal lover, had lots of pets, rescued animals, did the whole works. And she didn't like harm to animals. And one of her colleagues was an ex-farmer type person or had a rural background, and they were okay with the harm to animals, weren't so fan of the harm to people. So they would trade work between them. You may also have rules around your hours, when you do work, how you arrange work. I once had a staff member who went home one day. She'd been working on difficult material all day, and her daughter fell over in the playground. Her daughter was 5 and had a cry because she scuffed her knee. And her first thought that popped into her head was, oh, harden up, kid. There's plenty of children out there doing it much worse than you. She didn't say that. It just popped into her head. And she was wise enough to realize, hang on a sec, that's not okay. I shouldn't be having that thought when I'm dealing with my family. So she brought in a rule where she would not deal with any graphic material after afternoon tea or after afternoon break. That was it. She's on to emails, admin, policy, training, whatever it was. That gave her the cool down time she needed to be able to focus on her family when she went home. Thought that was really smart. And that was a rule that we all, supported and endorsed. Share what makes you feel better. Is it playing with your puppy, going for a walk, having coffee with the team, going for a run, going to the gym? What is it and how does it impact you? Because your team members, your peers, they're going to be the ones who spot this not happening. They're going to be the ones who spot you haven't gone to the gym lately, hopefully anyway. They're going to be the ones who spot you eating junk all day long, you haven't had a lunch break, and hopefully they're the ones who are at that point A, B, and C on the wellness graph or on the difficulty graph. They're the ones who are going to say, hey, you, take a break. You need a break. You have to go and look after yourself. Otherwise, the harms you're dealing with may compound. And share your signs of stress. For me, it's probably not talking, like getting really insular, or eating too much junk food, or not taking a break. Whatever it is for you, it might be that you get really snipey and angry with people, and your team deserve to know that. Your peers deserve to know that, so they can maybe think better of you, rather than jumping to, oh, that person's a bit terrible. They might go, maybe they're a bit stressed. Hang on a sec. I've also noticed they haven't brought the gym bag in. Maybe we should talk. Share those signs. Get that out there. Ask to share work if need be. I've had team members who just got tired of dealing with horrible stories from youth crime. They're like, hey, can someone else take this on for a bit? I just need a break from it. And building a culture where that's acceptable is really important. And I think it's really helpful. And I think it's really a good idea to share with your family and your support network what it is that you're dealing with at work. Now, there's often this mistaken idea that those of us who are working in the space don't want to, or maybe legally forbidden from talking about the details of our work. And that's all well and good. But we are generally in a space where we can talk about the fact that the work is hard. People will, knowing your work, assume the worst about what you're looking at and what you're dealing with anyway. They will just assume you're dealing with beheadings all day long if you're dealing with any kind of war, right? Or if you're dealing with crime, they're going to assume the worst there as well. You can say, look, I've had a really hard day at work, had to look at some stuff. It wasn't really fun. I'm feeling a bit down. Really important to let your family and your support network know that you deal with hard work and you may at times come off feeling a little grim. They don't deserve the impact of that work impacting them without any awareness. I once talked to someone who said that they, at the end of the day, had to go to the gym for an hour every day. That was their cool down time. And his partner did not understand why he wasn't home to help with the kids. And that was causing tension in the marriage. And I was like, oh, dude, you can tell your wife you've had a hard day. You can explain the work is difficult. Like, this was not something that was out of the realm of possibility, but he, for some reason, felt it was. I hope that he did go and have that conversation and help explain what he needed to do to be there for the family when he was there. Develop a personal well-being plan, and that is a document, hopefully, that you put together with your supervisor. And I think it's just going to be many of these topics we discussed. It's what upsets you. How will you manage the work? Do you like certain types of routines? I've talked to work groups in the past who graphic material is a thing that the team does between 10 and 12. That's the time every day where if they have to look at fresh stuff, that's when they will do it. And it allows them to break the work in a certain way. Work-life boundaries. I think it was one of the Bellingcat staff talked about how when they were in lockdown, they would go to the office, which I know many of us do work from home, and the office meant going to another room. And when they went to the office, they would change into their outdoor clothes. They would sit down, they would do the work for a period of time. And at the end of the day, they got changed out of those clothes and they closed the door on that room. They went and had a shower, and it allowed them to have a break from the work. One of the challenges I have with our staff is we've got a lot of young staff, and they're in flatting situations or roommate situations, as Americans call it. And they don't necessarily have a lot of personal space. So they might be doing work in their bedroom if they're not careful. And we try to talk to them about, can they appropriately manage that space and the work-life boundaries and not let everything bleed over too much. We do worry about the impact of staff kind of diving sort of mentally 24/7 at all times they're at work. Not helpful, I think. So do discuss what those boundaries are for you. Work out a way with your peers, with your manager, to make that work.
That's a really important point, because even for me, like working from home full time, having not and the most graphic things I see nowadays are occasionally a post on like Twitter or something that's from a conflict zone, which is not part of my work. It's just within the feed, or you're on the dark web and you come across things that either allude to something that you definitely don't want to click on because the police will come and arrest you, or because like it's just the nature of the dark web can lead you down those paths. And even like not really thinking like that's exposure to graphic material too much, but still having that separation from work and home life can be very, very difficult when you're at home and it feels like 24/7 you're in the same space. So I think like some of those processes, even if you're not exposed to the graphic material, but you work from home full time, still being able to create that separation in some way, whatever you need, is super important just for your mental health, regardless of that exposure.
Yeah, I once talked to a senior in a team in police dealing with child crime, and he would do a bunch of little rituals. It was very ritualized when he had to deal with that material. First of all, I think like it's difficult for me if I'm dealing with my personal computer at home, the one I play games on a lot. Like how can I sometimes have a separation on a physical space which I use for entertainment but also use for work? But what he would do in his office was he would tap his feet a certain way. He would adjust the height of his chair, like so it's physically different position, which is an interesting one. And he would move certain things on his desk a certain way. Like I think he turned his family photo around, like he didn't want to associate looking at the work with his family photo. He would not listen to his favorite music when dealing with that work, because that can be tying, right? It can tie the work to the thing that you're enjoying. I know when I was a kid, I spent many hours studying calculus in my final year of high school, and I listened to Vivaldi's Four Seasons like on repeat. I don't know if it's just a me thing or a spicy brain thing, but for years afterwards, every time I listen or hear the Four Seasons, calculus would come flooding back, right? So we got to be careful what we tie to the work we're doing physically, sounds, emotion, smells, all of those things. And he did that. And then at the end of the shift, he'd reverse that pattern. He'd turn the things around. He'd adjust his chair again. He would, do what, shuffle himself in the seat. And I thought that was quite a smart way for him to deal with the work he was dealing with. But yeah, it's really tough. And there's no easy answer for it when you are kind of the solo person, when you're the person working in the office, it's also your home. As office staff, I think it's on, for those working in organizations, it's on them to have that discussion to try and make sure that the boundaries are there. Discuss health and wellness. It is sort of, hopefully goes without saying, that when you're stressed or unwell, your capacity to deal with graphic material can really suffer. So I know that when I was, again, the same team dealing with child crime material, they knew each other's personal lives to a degree that I don't think I've ever heard of any other team before. They knew of breakups, they knew of relationships, they knew of children often before anyone else in the family or the staff member did, because they were so in each other's personal life. And I think that was part of their wellness support. Unconsciously, they needed everyone to be close so they could have conversations that would be quite difficult to have with just someone you knew casually at work. But having at least with a manager, an honest conversation about your wellness and being able to say, look, I'm dealing with a lot right now at home, or something horrible's happened, or my grandmother is sick. It's really stressing me out. I need to take a little bit of a break from dealing with the worst of this material, because I don't think I can put all of those things together into me without it causing harm. Because what can be perfectly fine one day, when you're already stressed, unwell, adding that in can be terrible the next day. So do pay attention to your health and wellness and have those conversations. Also, let your manager know, if you're comfortable with this, who is your support network? Like, do you have family, friends, partners, flatmates? What is it that support you at home? If your family needed to reach out, could they reach out to your manager? Could they say, hey, look, I'm a bit worried about so and so. My partner is looking really stressed at home. Is everything okay at work? What does that support look like? Can the family get support even? That's more of an organizational topic later on. But it might be helpful for managers and teams to know who it is that helps look after you. And what makes you feel better? Is it the team coffee that makes you feel better? One of the staff I dealt with once, or worked with once, she told us at one of our very first team meetings as we were building the organization that she didn't really feel she knew us very well. And her cultural background was really large family, lots of socializing, getting to know each other, being really close. And we sort of acknowledged, yeah, we've only just started as a team and we're dealing with a lot of work. It's really cool, but we don't really know each other. So we made sure to go out every week, have coffees together, just a chill out time, just talking casually, a couple of evening socials. It was really important to her that she felt connected to us as people, not just as colleagues. And I thought that was really helpful ideas from her. But also, just those other things. Is it going for a run that makes you feel better? Is it time with your family that makes you feel better? Help your peers help you stay well. And a personal well-being plan, it could just be something that you share just with a manager, but hopefully as well, some of those topics come up in other conversations around your networks. How do you like to be supported? Some of us like to be told really directly, hey, you don't look well. You need to go for a run, or you're coming for a coffee with me right now. Let's go. You need a break. Other people would find that too confronting and would prefer perhaps a little direct message. Are you okay? You look a little stressed. You're binging candy nonstop for 3 days. Whatever it is. Like, how do you like to be supported, and have that discussion so that people feel okay approaching you. Yeah, you want to allow people and give people the permission to have those conversations with you. As a team lead, there's a lot you can do. And this is really, I think, where the rubber meets the road. So much of the supporting of teams comes down to what team leaders are up to. I think the first point is make sure that wellness is on the agenda for team meetings. Put it in there. It should be part of the everyday work conversations. How is the work going? Is anything upsetting anyone? This task looks a bit difficult. How's it? How are you responding to it? Do you need a hand? That kind of stuff. I think share expectations with staff on self-care. So that comes into something we'll talk about in a second, team wellness plans, but also, let them know, look, I think we've all had a really difficult week. Friday, we're going to go have a coffee together a bit earlier than normal, or we're going to do something different, right? And let staff know that you would like them to share, discuss, talk about this material with each other. It's really important that culture is built, and that you have a kind of culture where in a team people will talk about it. It even comes down to when we're recruiting, we think about the team fit. We have to have people who are going to be okay being open, I guess. Not everyone has to be fully open, and we have our share of introverts, but having conversations where people are sharing their work experiences is really important to us. Embrace your cultural quirks. I know we've talked a bit about this, Aaron. Everyone in our space will have, tends to have some pretty dark sense of humors at time. Those of us of a certain generation remember Abu Hajar. That was like the funniest thing in the office for like weeks afterwards. And obviously dark memes and jokes can be really common for teams dealing with this kind of work. Often the darker the work, the darker the jokes. I know once I watched a group of the child crime team at police, child sex offender registry, having a beer at the 15th floor at our top of our building, and they're all standing in a circle joking and laughing. And I watched someone from outside their work group walk towards them with a beer. And then as they got closer, they heard the conversation, and then they just walked in the other direction. It was quite funny to watch. But, some cultural quirks are normal. Obviously, you can't go too far. And for me, that would be anything that denigrates victims, anything that makes light of what's going on to a too much degree. And I think too much is, it when you see it for your team and your context. Some of it is just normal, is how we cope with grim situations. Anyone who's ever had a friend who's a paramedic or a doctor will just hear the most horrendous stories treated in the most casual way. That's kind of normal for them. And I encourage people to embrace what is a stress relief, but again, don't allow what is becoming particularly grim, exclusionary, hurtful, harmful. As a team leader or manager, share your own vulnerability. It's really important to set the right tone. I once gave a talk like this to team in New Zealand Defence, and as part of the talk, I asked the major to share his own stories. I prepped him for this, and I said, "Hey, before we begin, I'd like you just to set the tone and share some stories of difficult work you've done." And he shared some really tough stories and the personal impact it had on him. And then an American visitor in the room shared stories about how he had dealt with war crimes in Bosnia, and like he'd photographed them, but actually dealing with sitting in a container in Baghdad for weeks on end, looking at torture videos to identify the offenders. That was what really got to him. That was what really sent him to major support when he got home. That was really helpful for the corporals and privates in the room to see that this wasn't an area where they should be, harden up. That was not going to be helpful. And the expectation from their officers was that they treat this seriously and look after themselves, and that it's okay to, this work may have an impact, but we can work together to get over it. Know what is normal for your staff as well. Like if you're a team lead, pay attention to what they do when they're in a good mood and everything's running well. And then if you have to write that down, write it down. What are the little signs? And then start thinking, is everyone well? Am I noticing someone is not bringing their gym gear in? Am I noticing someone is more snippy than normal? People going off having big gossip sessions, or, what's going on? Is there something I need to pay attention to so that you can start to correct it before harm sets in? And manage the team's exposure to graphic material. So this is what this sort of dial is on the right to remind me of. In my old job, we rated all the tasks we did out of 10. We just had a basic 8. This task was an 8. This one was a 5. And we used to joke that it was our head rating, how many heads we'd seen that day. And it was really helpful because I would go back every 3 or 4 months and I would just do a count on the staff and how much is Bob total score this quarter versus Jane versus whoever. And a couple of times I was able to see, oh, so-and-so's actually dealt with a lot more than everyone else. We didn't really plan it that way, but they've just picked up tasks that have turned out to all be pretty tough. And then I grabbed that staff member and said, hey, look, I've noticed you've actually dealt with a lot more than everyone else. How are you going? They'd be like, oh, yeah, I actually have. There's been some real back-to-back ones that have been a bit grim. But, oh, okay, well, maybe for the next couple of 3 weeks, we're going to put you on another job. We're just going to really make sure that the jobs you're doing are not rough. I think it's really helpful to pay attention to that. Develop the personal well-being plans. If you're the team lead, you can lead that. Have the conversations with the team as part of their performance assessment. Let's go through these questions and discuss your team's, your personal wellness and build that into their performance planning. And a team well-being plan is also really important as well. And that, to me, is when you get the whole team together, which we'll talk about in a sec, and discuss what can we do as a team to support each other and how do we like to work. Share this vision that you're developing with your leadership. Let the leadership of your organization know, hey, this is how we do in our team. Maybe the rest of the organization doesn't have those same pressures and doesn't have to care about this. Or maybe you're just the visionary team lead who does care a lot about it. But share that with the organization. Hey, we're going to engage in a bunch of activities as discussed in the team wellbeing plan. Share that with them. Say, I've got personal wellbeing plans with each team member. Let management know. And also connect with your organization's wellness teams if you have one, or the wellness support that is available. You should understand what is out there. Usually wellness teams are super excited to meet people who care about this. They have lots of resources at their fingertips. They can plug your team into professional support, or bring a massage therapist in, or yoga classes, or whatever it is that your organization does. I know for our team, a couple of years ago now, there was Mental Health Awareness Week, I think it was here, and the wellness team and police handed out or sent to every team a kind of conversation cards about wellness. And we actually threw these on our shared table in the office, and every time there was a team meeting, someone would pull out a card and ask everyone on the team the question on the card. And it was just quite a nice little initiative that the wellness team brought through that we took seriously, and it was useful, I would say. So what is a team wellbeing plan? It might be, how do we handle work from home? How do we handle wellness activities? Like, do we need to get together for coffee more? How's our physical environment? Are we well supported in the office space itself, which I'll come back to? Do we have to discuss how we handle tasks? Are we getting a lot of pointless tasks, which are very graphic? Do we need to push back on those tasks and ensure that they're actually having impact? Things like that. Connecting as well the team to the organization's initiatives, letting them know that they exist, reminding them that they exist. And for me, it was also once team member requested I buy fruit for the team. Like, hey, wouldn't it be nice if we had a fruit bowl? Now, there's no organizational plan to have a fruit bowl out there, but I take it upon myself to try and buy fruit for the team pretty regularly. And they enjoy having that little break, go and eat an orange or whatever it is. Just little things to make the team feel and understand that they're supported by their organization. And write that all down, stick it as part of your process work, and share that with management. Let them know this is what you're doing. The nice thing about writing all this stuff down and sharing it with management is when you get the feeling that everyone's a bit stressed, and you go, let's go have coffee. We're going to go do it. Stop what you're doing. We're off. No one's going to complain. Like, other teams will see you guys having more coffees than normal. Maybe they get snippy, and you can print out your plan and say, look, this is an official work document, part of our strategy. I need to do this for my team. There's nothing like an official SOP to make people back off, I find, even if you wrote it yourself. And,
Good advice.
So as a team, what's that?
Good advice.
Good advice. Yeah. It's a personal beef of mine that not enough people pay attention to things like policy and so on. Like, you just have to pay attention to it, and it can be it can unlock so much capability. Just making sure you've got good guidance and rules and you've thought about things. So I think to think about as well as a team lead or a manager is, what are the sort of things that are going to increase the chance of my team having, or team members having, a difficult time? So if a team member has an avoidant coping style or a personal history of trauma, they're at greater risk of having harm from graphic material. I'm not exactly sure personally, to be honest, what an avoidant coping style would look like. I'd be interested in anyone's thoughts on that. But my hunch would be people who are really super unwilling to discuss their personal wellness. Some people will share way too much and some people will share zero. I probably would prefer to have the person who shares a bit too much, because I know at least there'll be someone who will step forward and say, oh, I'm having a really tough day, or my leg is acting up, I'm feeling unwell, I'm going to take a break from this task, whatever it is. Someone who just bottles it all up, yeah, you need to support them more. A personal history of trauma is something I've seen written but not explored a lot in our community. And I have a hunch, I can't back it up, that people have dealt with real world trauma, in particular, say military or frontline staff and police and so on. They have a higher risk of experiencing trauma response when dealing with graphic material. And the way I kind of think about this is that if you're like one of my ex-colleagues, you've been to war zones and wandered past the dead bodies of people in conflict, you've got all your senses acting at that moment. Your sight, your hearing, your sense of smell, touch, all of those things are animated by that experience. And when you go off and now you're in an office and you're watching a video, you're reminded across all of your sensory experiences of that time. And as we know, sense of smell, that can be an absolute direct main line into the brain. And although you might not be dealing with smell, the memory of those things comes back to you. So when I deal with war footage, I don't really have any personal history of having to deal with all of those experiences all at once. Other people do, and I think sometimes our work can remind them of personal experiences that were particularly tough. So just consider that as well when you're supporting people in this space. If your team is dealing with a lot of trauma and it's dealing with it very frequently, or high intense trauma frequently, as discussed in the radiation metaphor, that is massively going to increase risk. You may have to find ways to break up the work, push back on certain types of work, or switch work around to reduce the intensity and frequency. A risk that's kind of under thought about is inconsistent leadership and conflicts with managers. And the metaphor here I like to think of is that when we deal with difficult work, we're a bit like a coffee cup, or this mostly empty coffee cup here. In our day-to-day work, that coffee cup might be relatively full if we're dealing with difficult material. Any extra stresses we lay on top of that, things overflow and stuff falls apart. Most teams and most organizations that aren't dealing with that kind of work, they may have a pretty empty coffee cup, so they can deal with a lot of change and inconsistency, policy changes, restructures, office moves, all of that stuff without a great deal of personal drama at work. But teams that are dealing with a lot already, you layer that on top and things can fall apart. And I have seen that in an organization where a team dealing with child material, that's pretty stressful. And the organization went through a bit of a restructure and an office move all at once. And there was a change of management and the team kind of fell apart. People left, people got upset with each other, and it seemed out of step with the organizational change that was going on. And what I reflected was they were already dealing just with a lot in their day-to-day work. Adding on those layers, really difficult for that team. So if you're a manager in those spaces, you've got to figure out ways, if you're facing those changes coming up, that you reduce the impact on the team, space it out, or reduce the amount of or type of work they're doing for that period. So let's talk about some technical mitigations now. And many of these will be familiar to you, I would imagine, if you've ever looked at this topic, because they come up quite frequently. And it's a kind of a personal bugbear of mine that I find a lot of wellness advice in this space expects the staff member to do all the work. You're the one who's got to manage your exposure. You're the one who's got to look after yourself. You didn't turn on the blur extension, whatever it is. So I do want to caveat these with saying I find these really helpful, but on their own, they're not enough. Organizations and teams need to step in to support themselves and each other. So first of all, do you perhaps watch the video first muted and then listen to the audio without watching the video? I know a team in New Zealand government who do that, and they find it helps them break up the impact of the work they're dealing with. And I think that's really clever. It allows them to pay full attention to the audio, which they may need to, and to the video, but they're not dealing with the trauma of the video full force in 4K, surround sound. Play videos in smaller windows. Just if you're dealing with a horrible video, just pull that tab out and shrink it right down. Makes a massive difference to not having to see everything in high def. Where there's something in the video you need to come back to, you can always go, oh, yep, 3 minutes in, I definitely need to come back to that. and then you can come back and watch it without having to perhaps deal with the most traumatic parts that might be elsewhere in the video. Scrub through the timeline. If you're on platforms like YouTube, you can mouse over that timeline and just work through it and find where the horrible thing is going to be in the timeline. That can be really helpful to avoid surprising yourself. Surprise is an absolute killer in this space, which we'll talk about. Avoid surprise at all costs. Try and be forearmed, forewarned, so that you know what's coming up. And you may know that you don't need to watch that particular part, and you can ensure you don't get to that part. Search for the URL or the video ID or the title of the video or the context of the video. You might find other people talking about it. I find quite often on Reddit, people will talk about, the cartel video that someone's linked to on the subreddit. And people are saying, oh, I don't want to watch that. What's in it? And someone says, oh, yeah. And they'll break out the video for you. Can be really helpful to help you assess, A, do I need to watch it? Or B, and now I know what's in the video, I'm better prepared. I'm not going to be surprised by the video. So you'll find people discussing videos quite often, and hopefully they've done a bit of the legwork for you. Should you perhaps watch the video in black and white? So there are some filters, extensions out there. There's one I just Googled, retro YouTube filter. I'm sure there are for each browser. You can go and watch a video in a different color. For VLC, for standalone video playback tools, there are usually options to turn videos into black and white in those tools as well. I encourage you to figure out what they are. Watching stuff in black and white is a lot less impactful than watching it in color. I know they even talk about for mobile devices these days, for people who feel they're a little addicted, you can get black and white themes that make your entire phone interface black and white, all the apps black and white, and it kind of reduces the need to sit and doom scroll. Something about not being in color doesn't keep our attention as much. So quite a good one there. The other thing you can do is install extensions. I found these two just casually Googling that will blur all the photos on a page, and you have to click to unblur them. If you're dealing with certain types of pages or sites or content, maybe you just want to start blurring everything. I do worry that might lead to more surprise as you unblur, but I guess you can kind of set perhaps how blurred something is, so you can kind of get a hint of what it is before you decide to look at it. Yeah, could be a good strategy as well. Another thing to do is just to block out the horrible stuff that's on the screen. I've known teams that have stacks of Post-it notes nearby, and when they go to search for something, they will, or look at something on their screen, they will throw a Post-it note over the part that's horrible. I noticed the other day doing this slide deck, you can see that on my work browser, I search up something troubling, Syrian war, and by default, that Safe Search Blur feature turns on, which I didn't know was a thing. So good on Google for doing that. But usually I can get away with just sometimes I'll hold my thumb up. I'm a kind of an inveterate or sort of international conflict watcher. My politics background, I'm interested in it. But if something comes across my feed, I'll often just hold up my thumb, close one eye. I kind of want to know the context of the video. I don't need to see all the details. That in and of itself saves me from dealing with a lot of horrible imagery. If you're planning to capture material, we will talk about this a bit more. Capture the full force of the item, but maybe the first thing you do with it after you've captured it is chuck it in PowerPoint, put a big blue box over the horrible stuff, and then you can study the details around the edges, the location, the sun, the shadows, the buildings, all those standard OSINT techniques. But you're preventing yourself from just casually having it in the corner of your eye, that horrible image at all times. Really helpful. And Nathaniel linked to me the other day a new sort of tool that'll blur out or block out entirely person in a video, which I think is great. I don't have a solid link for you. I'm sure it'll end up in the comments, but the idea being that you could put a video through the tool and at all times the people in the video are blacked out, which I thought was a really good idea as well.
I think that sort of technology, like it's coming on leaps and bounds. I was experimenting a couple of weeks ago with some deepfake technology, which will now do streaming. So you can like, if we were talking on Zoom call, I could be The Rock, which was how I was testing it. It looked like The Rock from Wish.com, not rather than me, The Rock being me in the biopic of my life, but just seeing how that technology is coming on so far. Where like the deepfake, it responds to your facial features in real time. The mouth moves in line with you talking, like everything's there. So I think like And again, this is like one of those uses for AI technologies as well as that develops.
Mm,
Like seeing
yeah.
this come on, it's
And
going to be incredible.
yeah, I mean, an immediate one I would hope to be able to do is in the very near future is just feed a URL or feed a video to an LLM and have it summarize it and say, hey, this is what's in the video. And you might be able to say, look, the bit here where this horrible thing happens, can you just block that out? And the LLM will spit out a modified version of the video for you. So, or the image, so you don't have to see it. Obviously save off the real stuff, but if you can reduce the impact by giving yourself some separation by text or by other kind of summarized work, really, really helpful. And I think I forgot to mention earlier was like work with your peers to break work up. If there's a 10-minute video of horrible stuff, maybe you watch 2 minutes each. Don't have to watch the whole thing, and then you can get together and summarize until those technologies or the summarizing technologies are widely deployed. But yeah,
I have seen some of
I do
those
look
video
forward to those.
technologies which will do things like if you can upload, like for example, we could upload this, copy this webinar, and it will summarize the content and the discussion, and it will pull out things for like podcast synopsis and things like that. So it gives you that almost play by play of what goes on in the video. And you're exactly right, like being able to use that within the context of removing the necessity to actually have to watch content if you don't need to, but you can still get all the context without necessarily having to go through that trauma. I mean, the flip side of that potentially is maybe it's worse if you read it because you're picturing everything in your head. But I guess that's
sure. I guess
that's
it's
up to you as an individual potentially to figure
individual
out.
preference. Yeah, and I'm hoping that in the future as well, the tools that we do use, or the large ones, the small ones out there, will be able to feed off LLMs that when a picture is ingested by the tool, it assesses it and goes, oh, actually, I think this picture probably contains something horrible, and will maybe auto blur it, allow your summary to read it, and then choose to unblur it. Yeah, anything just to reduce the day-to-day background radiation exposure, I think is really, really helpful. And text has impact, as we'll discuss, but it can at least be a little less impactful for many of us than dealing with a raw video or images. But yeah, splitting up work with colleagues. Again, I talked with a team once, and they would deal with extensive offender reports that were pretty horrendous. And they would each read a couple of pages and get together and summarize it. And that way they were able to assess what they needed to assess out of the work without having to read the full story. It's really important, I think, and this is more of a meta one, don't share details unless you absolutely need to. Like, it's really easy, I find, for people to kind of trauma gloat, like, oh, I was dealing with this horrible beheading and this happened. You just don't need to. You don't need to either share that verbally to other people, but you also don't need to write it down. We'll come back to that. Reporting standards should hold that graphic material just isn't included. It can be made available if people need to, but it should not be the default part of any work that you do in terms of outputs. You shouldn't be traumatizing other people. Work with summaries if you can. So LLMs are going to do a great job with this, just summarizing content and working with peers to summarize as much as possible. Work with summaries. Understand the subtle stresses, and we talked about that, and you talked about it, Aaron, with talking about you're on the dark web, you know that link is going to go somewhere horrible. That is a stress. That is graphic. It may not seem so to the casual, war fighter or manager out there, but just dealing with the underside of what the world is up to at any one time, over time, it can lead to stress and harm. So acknowledge that and understand that it has an impact, and look after yourselves and your peers. So other sorts of general topics here, have things around you that are cute. I know or subreddit, the baby elephant subreddit, puppies subreddit can be really nice for people to take a break from their graphic material. Have it open in another tab. Give yourselves 10 minutes after a horrible task of looking at cute puppies. I've heard that playing high intensity games like Tetris or high focus games like Tetris, there's been some studies on this, can reduce your memory of what just happened, which probably explains why all of us gamers are a little addled. I'm not sure. But there's sort of a memory switching or a change happens when we're doing another high focus activity. It seems to reduce the impact of or memory of what we've just dealt with. So consider distracting yourself with games or some cute animals. Make playing Tetris part of your official work duties. Sounds pretty good to me. Arrange your workspace appropriately. I'll show some pictures around this, but do consider, can people look over your monitor? How is your office space arranged? Are people going to be surprised walking around the corner seeing something horrible? Must be avoided as much as possible. hard for an individual staff member to worry about, but managers absolutely should be worrying about this. Don't let people get surprised by graphic material.
I've seen it before where
Yeah,
you take a group of people within a team who are doing particularly nasty work. So, they're getting exposed day in, day out. And somebody might have the idea, well, what if we put them in their own room, and therefore we reduce the risk that somebody will get drive-by trauma, for want of a better phrase. And that sounds like a really good idea until you realize, but then they're like isolated, alone, getting traumatized day in, day out. And it's a very difficult balance. For those, I guess, predominantly people in government organizations where like this work gets investigated and, as daily action.
Yeah. I've got a couple of strategies for that. I'll show a couple of them in the next couple of pictures I'll pull. But yeah, I was talking again with Department of Internal Affairs staff about that. They worry about staff work from home and being isolated. They themselves have, their team I was talking to do have a sort of a more isolated space. But I think they kind of mandate that if you are dealing with the most of the worst stuff, that you do that at a period. And then at the end of that period, which might be in the morning, you come out and you have morning tea. It's almost like mandated. You do the work, you come out and you have coffee with someone. Like they are really serious about ensuring people don't sort of tunnel vision and isolate. That's a really, really good point. I think it's really important to mark the work that you're dealing with. If it's graphic, like keep maybe a censored version, but if you're keeping graphic material, and do question yourselves how often you really need to keep some of the stuff. Mark it. And there's just an example of some random files I threw in a folder. So that way no one is going to come into that and click on it and be surprised. Surprise is a real killer. I once read a story from one of the journalists in the UK who was I think he was an editor, and he was working in the user-generated content space during the first Gaza conflict. And he was actually on a big salad eating kick at the time. He's walking around the office, he's eating salad all day long. Everything's go 24/7, really high intensity. And then one of his staff basically turned the monitor and said, "Boss, look at this." Wham. And on the monitor was something horrendous. And that was it. Bang. He had a bit of a breakdown at that point, had to go home and spend a week off. And he couldn't eat salad for like weeks, apparently. Every time he went through the fruit and vegetable aisle at the supermarket, he felt ill. And his story was like, while he was in the space to deal with it and he knew what was coming, he was fine. But the surprise of seeing that material, that was what threw him over the edge. So I always try and think of ways we can reduce surprise, Nabisco surprise, because it always has a much greater impact than the material on its own, if you're forewarned, would have.
Do you think that was also like where you mentioned like that, like exposure levels as well, like that radiation analogy, which I think is a really good way of describing it, but where he's already had that tolerance built up to here, had a little break, and suddenly it's like, bam, now you're overexposed.
Yeah, and I think he was dealing daily with stuff that was unpleasant. And but he knew that he was sitting down to see something. He knew, okay, there's a video that's come out, there's something from Gaza, whatever it is. And what he wasn't prepared for was that sudden shock, like being caught kind of on the hop. He didn't have the mental state at that moment, mouthful of salad, for his colleague to do that to him. So it's a combination. Not only was the material graphic, but he was being shocked by it. And I think it's interesting. What I noticed after the first Gaza conflict was that the press stopped reporting a lot of horrible material. They've started to, and throughout the ISIS period, very careful about most mainstream, I'd say, Western media, very careful about it. During the Ukraine conflict, they've started to, like, people need to know there's horrible stuff happening, and we need to have some video on this out there. We need to show something, because perhaps they felt the story wasn't getting through. So even the press struggled to know where to dial it in. During the first Gaza conflict, those of us old enough to remember, 2013-ish, 2012-ish, if I remember correctly, there was a lot of high-def footage came out. Journalists on the ground photographing the aftermaths of bombings, and some really some stuff that stuck with me. And I wasn't even really focused on it. And the press was like just broadcasting that 4K over the news. And that really, I think, had an impact on the public. And people found that really unpleasant. Not only the studios, I imagine, to deal with, but the impact on the wider community. And then they had to dial it back, I think, for future conflicts. And now they're sort of swinging the needle a little bit more towards people need to know what's happening in the world. It's a difficult one. But again, surprise, Be really careful with that. Avoid repeat exposure. It's a really subtle one. We've had tasks where the staff member had to capture material, then he's had to put it together in some other document. He's had to write a summary on it. That repeated exposure can be really tough to deal with when, if you look at the horrible thing once, it's unpleasant. Looking at it 10 or 20 times, not great. That's why I encourage people to at least censor where possible the material. So it only has to be looked at once, and then follow-on work can be dealt with on, censored, redacted material. Healthier, I think. Here's an example of one of the police teams that I know very well in the child crime space. They have red LEDs they slap around their monitors. So they have monitors to do, work. And when they're dealing with graphic material, they push a button on the desk and the red lights light up. So that way, anyone in the vicinity knows, hey, this staff member is dealing with something horrible. I probably don't want to stand on that side of the desk. And at the start of the entrance to their office, they also have another sign saying, caution, staff in this work area are often dealing with graphic material. Basically no hangers on, no hanging around, please. I think this is quite a nice way of showing to the team, hey, look, the staff member is dealing with something horrible. They might want to have a bit of a break afterwards, but also don't be casually wandering around, coming around for a chit chat, looking at their monitor. You'll get a horrible shock. So quite a cheap and easy way of mitigating some of those risks there. Organizational structures. So this is the last section I want to talk about. Organizations should pay attention to this space as well. And many do, but some don't. All organizations do have health and safety obligations. So if you're dealing with an organization which is reluctant to take this seriously, remind them of their legal or contractual obligations. Remind them as well that there are some really severe risks for getting this stuff wrong. You could have staff leave. I've seen this happen, not in police, but I've heard about that from other organizations in government. Staff dealt with horrible stuff. It got too much. They left the organization. That staff member is now potentially aggrieved, potentially knows secrets that you don't want them to be sharing around, may come back with a personal grievance. Organizations have dealt with that before. So even the most hard-headed and heartless senior manager out there understands the risks of the organization getting sued and would hopefully like to avoid it, even if they all think everyone needs to harden up or some old school silly story, right? So you can highlight these. It's really important you get this stuff right. The risks are really there for organizations to get it wrong. I think policies and SOPs must exist, first of all. They don't always. They must be supportive and lay out expectations. And this is both like saying things like, staff have a right to switch off a task that is horrible. Staff have a right to various kinds of care. Managers are responsible for looking after staff and ensuring that they're treated well. Write these things down. It makes a world of difference for teams to know, hey, look, there's actually a policy about graphic material. We have a policy about it, and it says, we have these rights and we are looked after. Managers must understand the risk of not supporting staff well. I think we have talked about that a bit as well. Senior managers should set the right expectation. If you can get a senior manager to talk about their personal experience of dealing with risk and trauma, can really help set the right tone for the staff under them, who all want to, be seen to do well, don't want us to show any weakness in the office, that kind of stuff. No, you can't have that. If you're having these conversations as an organization, get the senior managers involved. If they're ex-military, they'll have stories. If they're frontline staff, they'll have stories. Everyone has a story to tell. Get them to share it. And professional support should be available. Ideally, maybe a psych every now and then, or at least counseling or therapists. It should be easy to find that support. People should be able to make a call and get that help. And also managers should be able to get support as well in terms of, hey, I've got a staff member I think is dealing with issues. How do I support them? Who can I call? How can we help them through this? Someone hopefully in your organization, that's their job, to help managers and staff deal with difficult work. Other things to do, and this is absolutely crucial, work must be meaningful. I'm going to harp on this a little bit because it's so crucial. If the work does not have an impact that staff feel, the harm goes up. I'm 100% convinced of this. I've seen staff in other organizations, or one other organization, quit after dealing with weeks of graphic material. The work was then not used. They were like, oh, thanks, that was cool. Actually, we don't really need that now. Good job. In that case, 2 staff members immediately quit. It was too much. Like they thought they were doing important work and difficult work, and then it was thrown away. Likewise, when I was researching this, I heard of a journalist in the UK who had done a whole piece on an Iraq truck bombing. Those of us around remember how horrendous those were. So he was gathering all the user-generated content, creating a whole bit, had a piece prepared, spent the whole day on it, and then at 6 o'clock, Prince Charles at the time did something, and that bumped his news item for Prince Charles. And at that moment, his item thrown away and discarded, not to be used. Apparently, that was when he had his breakdown and he had to go on leave because he'd done all this horrible work and he felt it had purpose, and suddenly it didn't have purpose. He was done. And what we do in our team is we have a review cycle. So every task that we do, anyone who requests work from us, we gets a follow-up email about a week later saying, hey, was this work useful? Was it timely? And was it effective? And we do that for two reasons. Well, the first reason is there's an ethical, moral reason. I think if we're doing work, it should have a use. It should be useful. I don't want our work just to be done because someone thought it was fun to have us go do it. It's important that our work is meaningful in that way. So that's great. And the second thing is it's really, really good for the team because my team's not directly connected. We are not sitting in an investigations branch hand in glove with detectives. We're a step back. It's important for them to know that the work was useful. And there's been a few surprises where we've done work and the results come back. That was amazing. I did this and we followed up with that. And because of this, we caught this guy and now he's facing more jail time than he otherwise would have for his horrible crimes. And unless we asked, we just wouldn't get told. And the team, they'll ride on that high for a couple of days. That was awesome. We made a real impact, really important.
There's
and
a
I
really
have a rule in our
important
team. Yeah.
third point to that as well, is that you're the only individual I think I've ever met who's managed to complete the intelligence cycle.
So. Oh, the intelligence cycle, don't get me started. The intelligence cycle is a flawed concept. I got a whole rant on that, which I'll save for another day. It's a good crutch, but it's flawed for a bunch of reasons, I think. Anyway, we'll park that one. But the other thing that we have in as part of the review cycle is that if someone doesn't reply to us telling us, hey, this was useful or not useful, or it was great, we won't do work for them anymore. I'm really firm on that with the team. I said, we will not do work for people who will not take 30 seconds to write us an email saying thanks and why it was good. It becomes unethical. Like, I'm not sure this work is meaningful, useful, proportionate, necessary. I can't tell. And secondly, that staff will never know if they've had an impact. And it's important they know they have an impact. I've got staff who will, stay till 8 or 9 o'clock. Something important's come through. They know it's a big deal. And they're just like, I'm going to smash this. I'll pick up some, I'll take some hours off the next day or what have you, but they want to get it done. And I think one of the reasons they know they can do that and are empowered is that they know that they're going to hear if it was important, and they know the utility of it. Have rules to avoid double handling. Like, make sure that stuff is not just being passed around endlessly and exposing person after person after person to graphic material. Reporting standards in an organization should account for graphic material. I have seen reports many years ago from an organization that will remain nameless, which was about a military base in Iraq. And on the front of it was, here's a car bombing that happened today. Poof, photo right there. And I was like, the minister does not need to read that. Like, I can understand the enthusiasm of the person who put the report together. They really wanted to show, yep, serious business is happening over there. But really, they could have done with just a summary. Hey, there's been a car bombing. This is the outcome. Try not to include graphic material in reports. If graphic material does need to go in reports, it's on an organization and on managers to regularly check in, is this report being read? I've seen reporting where some poor staff members had to deal with horrible stuff day in, day out. And then you go and ask the people who are receiving that report and they haven't even read it. You're like, wow, that's a mistake, right? So make sure your standards account for both the need for the material and that it's actually making a difference to someone's life. Otherwise, don't report it. This is a great idea I've seen from New Zealand government agency, from the Department of Internal Affairs. When they bring staff in to deal with graphic material, they give them because they deal with some pretty horrendous stuff, as do obviously our child crime teams and police. They deal with some pretty horrendous material. They will brief them, this is what you're going to likely see. And I think they even, in some cases, are allowed to show them, this is the work. They well prepare them. And at that point, there are people who say, you know what? I thought this sounded really cool, but facing it in reality, I'm not up for it, and they back out. But the other one I've seen, and I think is a fantastic idea from DIA, is that when staff in those work groups leave, they are followed up with at sort of 3 months, 6 months. Are you all right? Do you need a hand still? How are you going? And they try and ensure that the person is not kind of just dropped. They had all the support while they're at work, and as soon as they're out of work, bang, support is gone. No help for you, pal. Organizationally, that opens the organizations up to all kinds of risks. Obviously, someone could file a personal grievance, get upset, go to the press, complain, deal with their stress in really unhelpful ways. It gets blamed on the org. So just pragmatically, offboarding them well is a good idea. But also morally, I think we owe a duty of care to our staff, right? So that's a really interesting idea. An idea I've seen come from an Australian organization is they gave a letter that would go home to families, and it would just kind of explain, hey, your loved one in the course of doing their duties may be exposed to difficult and traumatic material. It can be upsetting, and we would encourage you to, if you're concerned about this or concerned about your loved one, here are some support services you can reach in the organization. This can be a really great way to ensure a full wraparound support for staff, that they are connected, their families are connected to the problem, understand the staff's position. It allows the staff to have a conversation where perhaps otherwise they may have, oh, I can't talk about work, it's too sensitive or it's too upsetting. The staff can say, well, I got a letter from your organization saying the work is difficult and you might have challenges with it. I'm sure you can talk about it a bit. It opens up a conversation. And I've seen this work really well. Had a staff member who we did this in another organization, and they dealt with something really horrible at work. It upset them, took them out for coffee. And afterwards, she got on the phone to her mum, just had a chat to her mum, saying, hey, had a hard day at work, just want to have a chat. And she came back kind of all bright-eyed, and it kind of really just settled the situation for her. She reached out to support. The support knew that she wasn't going to really be able to talk about the details, wasn't really appropriate to do that, but also knew that she dealt with hard stuff and just wanted to have a chat to mum. And I thought that was really nice. So can be an option. And really, I think when you layer all of these things together, when you layer organizational, team, your peer-to-peer support, the technical support, you can kind of build a wellness program that is integrated across your organizations and connects everyone to the kind of support they need to do well. And yeah, that's my talk. I hope you took away something useful from it.
That was incredible. Thank you so much, Peter.
You're welcome.
I think it's such a almost strange topic to talk about, right? Because what might be like traumatic for you or I might be completely different for the next person. And I think, like, you came back to when I mentioned dark web earlier, so actually it's kind of like like graphic material in what you're seeing, because you're making a decision, and you know in some ways what that's probably going to lead to, and you still have to register that, which I hadn't even considered, to be honest. So I think understanding how organizations can put these measures into place, and I think a lot of the things you said, Aaron, it's just basically like being supportive of each other and saying, well, actually, yeah, I find when I'm stressed, I do these things. And if you suddenly think that I'm being like rude, obnoxious,
grumpy,
or grumpy, or any other descriptive words you might like to think of that are not safe for YouTube, like, feel free to reach out to me and ask if, like, because it's that kind of thing where you're not necessarily going to think of it, but actually, yeah, these like telltale signs are indications that something's not quite right, and just being able to pull yourself away from that situation for a minute, go for a coffee, have a chat, get some fresh air, whatever you need, can actually be really important just to your like mental well-being and like, I guess, the tolerance of your colleagues as well.
you have to, I think, this can be tough because the culture of the team has to really foster this approach. When we onboard people in our team, it's one of the first things we talk about is, hey, we deal with some difficult material. This is how we work. This is our, and I'll often be like, this is how I've dealt with it in the past. This is my experience. And I will encourage them to have that conversation. The expectation is that team members will engage. And very fortunately for us, we've had a really good run of people who are happy with that. If you're if you're working in a team that's not the culture, that can be really hard. But at least if you can look after yourself at that point. But I think often the door has to be opened to that conversation, and hopefully everyone walks through and has it. If that conversation has never even started, that's when the harms creep in. That's when the culture goes bad. That's when people gossip or moan, or get into these weird situations where they're not reading each other with kindness, right? Not approaching each other's at work with kindness. And I think that's really important. And it's actually one of the challenges with things like work from home and a lot of remote work is some of the subtlety might be lost from conversation because of text or email or what have you. And that can make people react poorly to other people's response. Whereas in person, they might go, actually, they look a bit not right. Like there's something else going on here. And they might ask the supervisor, hey, do you want to have a chat with Aaron? He's looking really grumpy. Or maybe they're brave enough to have that conversation themselves.
It's just Monday.
It's just Monday. Yeah, and that's another thing. Like some people are like, I'm not going to deal with, your personal wellness plan might be before 10 a.m. on a Monday, just ignore me. I'm just in my own little world and I'm grumpy and that's just me. Or I need a couple of coffees, or this is my prime time for working. You need to leave me alone during these hours, like 10 to 12, I'm all cylinders, or whatever the work is. They're helpful conversations to have anyway. And I think in our space, they're mandatory.
Yeah. I think also this topic as well, I think it's so relevant for the burgeoning private sector. Well,
yeah,
not necessarily just open source intelligence, but cyber threat intelligence and any sort of role now where people are looking at things on the internet that could one way or another take you down a rabbit hole where the exposure, whether it's not intentionally getting exposed to trauma, but where you expect it or you might not. Organizations, government organizations, particularly across the Five Eyes, and I guess probably most of the Western nations, kind of understand it and get it, and there are all these mechanisms in place for support, and it's an open conversation. But I think the private sector is probably clearly going to be a way behind that. And they might hide behind, you get private healthcare or something, and there's options there. But actually, small intelligence teams probably do need to have these conversations and understand this. And I think being able to do this on an open forum like this is what's really, really useful. And I think the fact you can give such a powerful presentation without, here's my 5 favorite examples of trauma. It's a really obtuse thing,
trauma dumping.
Yeah. So without having to do that, or people necessarily having to already have been through that. But now, if you run an intelligence team, you can think, actually, let's think about how we do this. Yeah. And I know a couple of years ago, Nico Dakins wrote a blog about vicarious trauma and open source intelligence research from all his time doing counterterrorism work, which is a really fascinating read as well. But I think it's one of those things that we do have to get grips with in the private sector, because we're probably not doing it, or we've probably got people from government and law enforcement backgrounds, military, who have had some experience or have done some of this work. But again, bringing possibly more junior analysts come into the fold who don't have that background or that experience or that sort of maybe built up resilience. So putting these ideas out into the open, I think, is a really important thing we do, especially at the moment with increasing geopolitical tensions, increasing conflicts, and I guess I wouldn't say the death of Twitter. As we're recording this, everybody seems to be going to blue sky, but with the advent of Telegram becoming more prominent, with Twitter being I guess historically has been over the last 10 years the de facto platform for sharing videos from conflict zones. There's no, how often you see something that's here's a video from a Ukrainian trench where some Russian gets shot, and you're like, oh right, I was just having a coffee, but I guess that's happening now. It's so difficult, I think, for even people who have a fascination with OSINT, maybe it's just a personal hobby, or if looking to break into the field as a role, who don't have those support mechanisms, or
Yeah, it's really tough.
those outside avenues. Yeah. So I think this has been a really, really like powerful talk, I think. So thank you for putting it
Mm,
together, because it's been fascinating for me to hear.
yeah.
And I think our audience is really, really gonna resonate with the content.
Mm. Yeah, I am more than happy to repeat it for anyone who wants it. It's a topic I'm really passionate about. And one of the things I just want to highlight is I haven't, obviously in this talk, done a talk about how the brain works. I haven't done a talk about stress. I haven't talked really about adrenaline. All of that stuff, I would hope that anyone who's had an official presentation from a psychologist on stress will have had that. And those are kind of a really common way to approach this problem. There'd be a diagram of the brain and the amygdala and all of that stuff. Those are all really valuable. And that's where I learned the kind of breathing technique and the noticing technique. I'm having a reaction. I don't like this. But I think it's tying those techniques and that advice, the mental health advice, into organizations actually taking a stand and making an effort, paying attention to this is just so important. You're right. It's really tough if you're a solo researcher. And one of the things I find is someone who's an inveterate international relations watcher is I will deep dive, neurospicy, get massively obsessed with the topic for a while. So for a long time, US elections, massively obsessed with it, follow it very closely, or did. And at a certain point, I occasionally will do a bit of a cleanse. I'll just be like, you know what? I'm kind of getting a bit too much into that. It's time to cut my feeds. And I just go through whatever the topic is, and I'll just be like, cut, 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 cut. I need a break, a palate cleanser. I need to go read a book or do something completely different. When you're researching and a home researcher, I think the risk is really high that what started off as a casual interest becomes a sort of all-encompassing stress. And you will have, if you're not paying attention, that'll catch you. I feel sorry and amazed at people like Oryx, for example, with his and the work the team were doing, capturing all the war wrecks, all the destroyed material out of Ukraine. I thought, what a fantastic initiative. But boy, I thought that must have been hard. And likewise on Reddit, there's a chap called False God, and he catches all of the Russian soldiers who are suiciding, killing themselves after drone strikes. And it's become a thing that he does. So on the Ukraine video Reddit, every time one of these videos comes up, they tag him in and he adds it to his tally in a spreadsheet. And I thought, that is a grim job you've given yourself. I mean, I think it's probably an important job, but boy, that's like to fall into that as an amateur researcher and then to absorb that is tough.
Yeah.
I think this is where communities like OSINT UK and others out there, which connect small teams or 1 or 2 person bands together and allow them to socialize and bring these topics up and discuss, is really, really important. So yeah, I'm lucky to work in a big organization which does have layers of wraparound support, people who pay attention to it, but not everyone does. Yeah.
No, for sure. And likewise, I guess now is the time for OSINT New Zealand.
I look at how much work you guys put into this, and I think, my goodness, we have a bit of a government community, at least a mailing list. I would love to do more, but it would be finding time in the day to do it. Make a wider public sector one or public one. Yeah.
No, Peter, thank you so much. It's been absolutely incredible.
You're welcome.
For everyone watching, we have a couple more webinars coming up over the next couple of weeks. I'll be speaking to Ben Hubel about the aftermath of the United States presidential elections, and how he thinks any misinformation, disinformation may have played a part of that, which is a great follow-on from the talk we had with Sander van der Linden ahead of the US election, which, if you've not seen, is a really, really interesting talk about how disinformation and misinformation gets spread, and like how those networks are performed and how they grow. And I'll also be speaking to Vlad Alaru, who is a Romanian intelligence analyst with the Romanian police, and that's going to be coming out in the next couple of weeks as well. So thank you for watching, and good night.